Over the past 2 years, I've scanned over 200 rolls of film with VALOI's easy35. So when they announced a completely redesigned version 2, I decided to find out if it was really worth upgrading. V1 replaced the slow, dedicated film scanners I tried when I first started scanning my own film. And I've really come to rely on how compact and convenient it is to use. That said, it hasn't been perfect, and VALOI says V2 was designed to fix the biggest issues. Let's find out if it does. Version 1 of the easy35 came out a few years ago, and it's awesome for what it is. A combined light source film holder that attaches to the front of a macro lens, letting you scan 35mm film with a digital camera without having to set up a copy stand each time. After all this time with it though, I've basically only had one complaint: uneven illumination. The built-in backlight is a little bit darker towards the edges, which can result in some weird artifacts like color shifts and haze if left uncorrected. And I'm definitely not the only person who's noticed this. VALOI claims that V2 improves light uniformity over V1 from 81% to 99%, using what they call an integrating dome. Rather than the LED shining directly at the film, they shine away into this white half sphere, where the light can bounce around before it comes back up through the film, theoretically solving the evenness problem for good. That's not the only change they made though. V1 has a knob for adjusting color temperature from warm to cool, while V2's color temp is completely fixed. They also claim tighter tolerances overall and better battery life. For this comparison, I bought the easy35 V2 upgrade kit with my own money. The only difference from the main kit seems to be that it doesn't come with the extension tubes and filter rings, which you'll already have if you're coming from the V1. I started off by setting up my usual camera lens combo on both systems, making sure to set focus on the film plane. But before getting to the actual scans, I wanted to take a look at the light sources by themselves, taking a normal scan just without any film in the holders. That should really help explain what we're going to see later. Now at first glance, there doesn't seem to be a big difference here. To my eyes, the corners on V1 are maybe a tiny bit darker. The issue is that with film scans, especially of negatives, that small difference gets magnified a lot during conversion. To turn a negative into a normal looking picture, you have to go in and set the black and white points sort of like I'm doing here, which adds a lot of contrast. The only downside of that is it can really emphasize any imperfections in the light source. As you can see, once I do that, the difference between V1 and V2 is pretty obvious. There's what looks like a little residual vignetting on V2, but that could easily just be an artifact of my lens, not the light source. And all these little spots are just dust on my sensor. Either way though, what's important is that V1's light is much more uneven. As a small side note, VALOI often implies that these illumination issues with V1 only show up when scanning with wide-angle lenses. But my setup here is a 65mm macro lens on APS-C, which is basically a short telephoto. Okay, now with all that in mind, let's get to some actual scans. I used the pixel shift mode on my Fuji X-H2 along with my Laowa 65mm macro lens set at f6.7. The same tube setup got me a slightly wider crop on V2, but it shouldn't be enough to change any takeaways. I white balanced each shot on the film border and then batch cropped using an extra plugin called Autofilm Crop. Then I converted everything individually in Negative Lab Pro. For each V1, V2 pair, I used all the same NLP settings. I'll show those on screen as we go. Let's start off with a shot where it's a bit harder to see the difference at first. Here's a truck I found outside Death Valley a couple years ago, shot on Kodak Gold at f2.8. This is the scan from the V1, and this is V2. To be totally honest, if you had just shown me the V1 scan, I wouldn't be able to tell anything was off. Flipping the V2 though reveals that V1 has that same uneven light pattern we saw earlier. Just since this is a negative inversion, it shows up as the edges getting brighter, not darker. What's kind of interesting is that it seems like the original photo already has some natural vignetting from being shot at f2.8, but on the V1 scan, the unevenness almost fights against it a bit. You can see that especially down here in the bottom left corner, where the shadows just look a little less smooth on the V1 scan. Now this one is a little easier to see. I shot it on Vision 3 250D and processed it in ECN2, so it's already a lower contrast negative to begin with. Plus, since it's a night shot with darker edges, the unevenness we were seeing before stands out even more now, especially in this top right corner where all these windows are. This next shot is probably the clearest example I could find. It was a long exposure on Ektar 100 through an 88 cooling filter if I remember right. Something about that combo makes the corners on the V1 scan go this crazy red color. As you can see, it's mostly gone with V2, although there's still a little bit of redness in the corners. That said, I can't say for sure whether that last bit is from the light source itself or just vignetting from my lens or some other part of the chain. Either way though, V2 is undeniably a huge improvement. The real question though, for me at least, isn't just whether the V2 scans look better uncorrected. It's whether I'll need to keep treating correction itself as a mandatory step in my workflow. The way I've been fixing this unevenness the past couple years is through a process called flat field correction, which is built into Lightroom Classic as its own tool. The idea is that you shoot a calibration frame of just the light source, just like the blank shots I showed earlier, and when it works, Lightroom will automatically correct for any unevenness it detects. I found I can get it working the vast majority of the time if I remove the film holder before taking the calibration frame, since any film holder edges left in the shot can confuse the program. So for this shot, I wanted to see how much flat field correction actually changes things on both versions. This is the V1 scan with no correction, and here's the same one after correction. And as you can see, it really helps a lot. That's why I've kept using V1 after all this time. Comparing it to the uncorrected V2 scan though, I'd say the edge goes to V2, although they are pretty close. Cranking up the brightness reveals that the flat field correction didn't quite get all the unevenness, although that's not exactly a realistic test. And comparing V2 to V2 with flat field correction, it's a pretty subtle difference. I can barely even tell with the side-by-side. That tells me I probably won't even bother with it going forward, except on particularly tricky shots like the skyline one from before. It did help get rid of that little extra bit of fall off, but I won't feel obligated to correct every single frame anymore. Now, the light uniformity issue was definitely the biggest change for me, but it wasn't the only one. On V1, there's this knob on the back for adjusting color temperature. The idea is you set it to cool for negatives, somewhere in the middle for black and white, and warm for slides. V2 gets rid of all that. Its light just has one fixed color temperature, which seems to be pretty close to the old cool setting. That's right where we want it for negatives, and for black and white, color temperature isn't too much of a factor. That just leaves slides. There is still some edge fall off with them, but since the image isn't being inverted, it just kind of darkens the corners a bit and looks more like normal lens vignetting. So I decided to compare the flat field corrected V1 scan with the uncorrected V2 scan, since I wanted to focus more on whether losing that adjustable color temperature affected the final result. And honestly, they're pretty close. Since V2's light is cooler and bluer, it seems to make the blues in the sky slightly brighter and the reds a little darker. It also maybe has a tiny bit more saturation overall, but this is just one slide, so I don't want to generalize too much. The main takeaway though is that when I look at the V2 scan, I don't really miss having to mess with that color temperature knob for slides. Besides the actual scan results, there are a few other notable changes with V2. Overall, it just feels like a more finished product. V1's housing has this rough 3D printed texture, and while V2 is still made from plastic, it has a much smoother and nicer feel to it. V2 is a bit taller, but I believe that's to make room for the new light source, so I think it's a pretty reasonable trade-off. The power button's on top now too, rather than being a slightly awkward to reach knob on the back. And you can see the charging indicator from the front now. You also may have noticed earlier that the shutter speeds for my scans were different between V1 and V2. That's because V2 seems to be around a half to one stop brighter as well. The V2 film holder also got a refresh. On top of the same material upgrade as the housing, it seems to hold the film a tiny bit more securely, although I never really had issues with film flatness on V1. Battery life should also be better, but I haven't really had the chance to test that for myself yet, and apparently V2 can run from wall power without slowly draining the battery, which was apparently an issue on V1. Now that brings us to pricing. Right now, the easy35 V2 is going for around $270 on B&H, and you can still get the V1 for around $200. If you're a first-time buyer, I think it's pretty clear that spending the extra $70 to get the newer version is kind of a no-brainer. But if you're someone who already owns the V1, is the upgrade really worth it? As I mentioned before, VALOI does sell a V2 upgrade kit on their site. It skips the distance tubes and filter thread adapters, letting you save some money and reduce some waste. But unlike the full kit, it doesn't seem to be available from North American distributors like B&H. At least not yet. So you might need to factor in things like international shipping and duties. Regardless, it is nice to have as an option. For me though, I do think it's worth it, especially with the upgrade kit, but I'm not exactly the average customer here. I want the cleanest possible starting point for my scans, and I shoot enough film that getting to simplify my workflow will be a big quality of life improvement. But as a general recommendation, it really just depends on how much V1's more uneven light source actually bothers you. If you've been perfectly happy so far, why mess with the system you already have? So overall, I don't really think V2 changes what the easy35 brings to the table. It's still the same basic idea, a compact and convenient way to use a digital camera to scan 35mm film. What changed is it gets you a much cleaner scan before you have to do any correction in software. With V1, I did get great results, but I had to work a little harder to get there, applying flat field correction to every single scan by default. With V2, I'll save any correction for the few scans that need it most. That's the real upgrade. If you've used either version of the easy35, drop a comment below and let me know what your experience has been like. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a subscribe. Thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.